This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you along. Do take a few moments, if you can, to subscribe to our channel, to make sure you ring the bell as well so you can be updated on all of our latest podcasts. So I'd also love to hear from you. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. This week, I'm doing a podcast here on a topic I got an email from a gentleman wanted some more information on carbon monoxide devices. And so I've already done a presentation on carbon monoxide devices, and that's on October 1st, 2019. So you may want to go and check that out if you're wanting to learn my suggestions on using the device and some tips and principles there that would maybe a little supplemental to what you're seeing in the instruction guidelines, because this particular technology, the usages is continuing to grow and refine as more and more wildlife control operators and PCOs are using the equipment and getting some experience in different types of soils and stuff like that. But today I want to talk a little bit more about carbon monoxide itself as the component as part of fumigation. So why don't we get started here? So we want to make sure we're defining what a fumigation is. So typically when we're doing with wildlife control and we're using pesticides, typically those pesticides fall into two broad categories. And I'm not referring to repellents here. Obviously, that's under the umbrella of pesticides as well. But typically when we're dealing with vertebrate control, we're dealing with toxicants, which are poison baits that the animal would consume, and fumigants, which is not aerosolized, but a gaseous form of the pesticide that the animal would breathe. And so those are different types of formulations that present the toxic ingredient to the animal in different ways, one through a gas form and another one through a solid form. And of course there are liquid baits as well, which would be a liquid form. So those formulation differences give you certain advantages and disadvantages depending upon your particular need. But the bottom line is, in order for a fumigation to work, there has to be sufficient amount of the toxic gas or the toxic portion of the gas getting into the animal that interferes with that animal's ability to live. Just like with a toxicant, the animal has to consume enough of the toxic bait in order to interfere with the functions of life. So pretty straightforward, but it's kind of important to make sure we're using our terms accurately here. So what are some advantages of fumigants? Well, fumigants have no secondary poisoning. Now remember what secondary poisoning is. If the first animal exposed to the pesticide dies, that's primary poisoning. If another animal comes and eats the animal that was killed by the poison, that is secondary poisoning. The benefits of fumigation is that there are no secondary poisonings, at least none that I've been able to come across. So the reason is because there's nothing staying in the tissues that's going to be toxic to the second animal. That's not the case for some of your rodenticides, for example. For your anticoagulants, for instance, if the mouse eats, let's say, chlorofascinone or difascinone, and then a cat or dog comes along and eats the mouse, there will be some transfer of that poison that killed the mouse because not all the poison's metabolized in the mouse. Some of that poison will enter into the dog or cat. Now, that doesn't mean that the dog or cat's going to be automatically harmed, because the same principle applies. The animal, the secondary animal, has to eat enough in order for us to notice whether there was any effect, for example. But there would still be secondary poisoning because that poison transferred to the second animal. But with fumigation, if you fumigate a rodent, for instance, and a dog eats the woodchuck that you fumigated, the dog may get sick, but it's not from the fact you fumigated the groundhog. So the beauty is there's no residual there. And so it's also more weather tolerant because you can use fumigants, and actually it's desirable, and I'll talk about that here shortly, it's desirable to use fumigants in moist soil. The reason is because it holds the toxic gas better than dry soil, because typically fumigation and for vertebrate control is done in burrowing rodents. I'm not talking about structural fumigation here, so be sure if you're listening to this podcast, I am not referring to structural fumigation at all. All of this presentation is on burrowing rodent fumigation, all right? So I want to make sure I'm clear about that in this particular podcast. Now, are there disadvantages with fumigants? Well, absolutely. Well, one is because a gas is much harder to control. You see my bottom point there. Whatever you're fumigating in that burrow, everything in that burrow is going to die. So, for example, you may have a non-target animal residing in the burrow system with the target animal that you may not know about, where with a bait, for instance, the bait may only target one animal. You say, well, how is that possible, Stephen? Well, think of it as perhaps, let's say, a garter snake with a woodchuck. The garter snake may share the same burrow system with a woodchuck, but the garter snake's not going to eat the rodenticide. But the woodchuck might. Now, there are no rodenticides for woodchucks, but I think you're getting the idea that I'm getting across here. But if you fumigate that burrow, both the garter snake and the woodchuck are going to die because they're both going to be breathing the toxic gas. Now, the other challenge with fumigants is that they are significantly more costly to apply. Now, in small acreages, that the difference is not big enough to be a big deal. But if you're dealing with larger acreages, let's say 10, 20, 30 acres, fumigation can become quite time consuming, particularly like out here where I live with prairie dogs. You may have 40 burrows an acre. And if you're injecting at a 3-minute injection time per burrow, well, you could be, do the math, 3 times 20, that's 120 minutes. But that doesn't even account for you moving from burrow to burrow, right? So you're looking at 2 hours just to finish 1 acre, and that's if you're able to perfectly and smoothly move from one burrow to another. So that could be quite time consuming, where when we're talking about applying a rodenticide, for instance, you could be done with that acre in, maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, depending how fast you walk. So it can be significantly more expensive. Now, there is that advantage, of course, you don't have any residual. So when you fumigate, you're not having to worry about, well, what else am I killing behind there? Now, let me do a little sidebar here. If you're fumigating with aluminum phosphide, there's a residual in the sense that the toxic gas may take longer to dissipate than carbon monoxide and other forms of fumigation. So typically there's only aluminum phosphide and carbon monoxide. Those are the big two. There's also carbon dioxide, but that's pretty minor in terms of the market right now. So there is a 48-hour exclusion on aluminum phosphide, but still the principles are the same. It's going to be dissipating over time. Okay, and I'll that's enough said about aluminum phosphide. I'm not really focusing here on aluminum phosphide today. I want to talk primarily about carbon monoxide. Okay, different with carbon monoxide generators. So we have 3 flavors of fumigants, as I mentioned earlier. So here we have carbon monoxide, not regulated in terms of the devices, but we do have carbon monoxide pesticides. That's your ignitable gas cartridges. Those emit a carbon monoxide. That's the active ingredient for those particular products. We also have carbon dioxide. It's important to keep those two apart. CO is different than CO2. Okay, definitely keep that in mind. And then, of course, phosphine gas from aluminum phosphide. Okay, so those are your basically your 3 fumigants used for burrowing rodents in the United States. So we're going to focus our attention, of course, on carbon monoxide. So the industry has really moved ahead in the area of carbon monoxide devices, which are essentially gasoline-powered engines where the gas from the exhaust is captured and pumped down into a burrowing rodent. So the Cadillac version that I call it here is a pressurized exhaust rodent control out of California. It is a totally powerful machine. I mean, this company has the most research on its particular product. It has when I mean research, I mean scientific, peer-reviewed research on its use, and you can see some of the information there. Ground squirrel control, it's achieved 85%. Pocket gopher control, it achieved a 62%. Talk to the manufacturer. He thinks that that he can get that 62% above 70% with some tweaks on application, and I think he might be right. We'll see, but I'll be frank. I'm still kind of impressed with a 62% control with this device, even when the manufacturer thought that there may have been some modifications to the application to improve it. I respect any company that's willing to put their product to the test. Rigor, some scientific rigor, and because it's not cheap and you're vulnerable, right? Because the results may not be what you want. And so, kudos to H&M Gopher Control. I don't make any money off this product. I just have respect for companies because we have so little interest within our industry in that because our market is so small. I'm grateful to those who are willing to put their products up for testing and the researchers that are able to do this. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any prairie dog studies on this with using this particular product at this time. However, I get anecdotally, and you can take this for whatever it's worth, that they're getting 90% control with a 4-minute burrow injection time, and I got that from a person working in Colorado. So certainly there's no doubt that carbon monoxide works on burrowing rodents. What about the Burrow RX? Well, the Burrow RX is another device that's on the market, and it is put out. It costs about $2,000 or so. Again, it's not regulated by the EPA. Again, my apologies there. Follow California laws. Of course, it says it kills pocket gophers and rats and ground squirrels with a 3-minute injection time. They have a California ground squirrel study where they said it was 95.7. It's a little bit more, I would say, white paper type study rather than a full-on peer-reviewed study. Nevertheless, certainly the efficacy seemed to be quite high there. And anecdotally, when I'm talking to individuals, I have not heard any major complaints about this with ground squirrels whatsoever. It has a smoke oil that allows you to see if there are 2 burrows connected with one another, which is a tremendous time saver. And so that's kind of a clever little addition. It's a little expensive, however, but it can save you some time because you're not having to now inject into another burrow because they're already connected. You're already injecting. The carbon monoxide cheetah, the cheetah machine. This is sort of, whenever I look at it, I keep thinking it's a glorified leaf blower, but it's sort of this gentleman's design here. And again, it's much significantly cheaper. And I do believe he has a try before you buy program. I am not aware of any research that's been done in this product. If you're aware of it, please let me know. I'd love to hear it. And he points out that there's 25,000 parts per million coming out of his device. I don't have all the data listed here and some of the other devices. I need to get that on there. But the point is, let me be blunt, all of these devices put out vast quantities of carbon monoxide. So that shouldn't really be a deciding factor for you in terms of your choice of one over another. They're all pouring out carbon monoxide. And so this may be something, if you're dealing with a lot of smaller areas, the carbon monoxide cheater may be something a little more portable for you, something you can fit in the truck and give that a whirl. I'm not sure I would really recommend it for large acreages. I talked with one producer who was using it on prairie dogs, and he was a little frustrated by how long the process was. Now, in hindsight, this was several years ago when I went out to the field with him, when I was just starting to get more introduced to the whole carbon monoxide field, that he found that, there was a 7-minute, the manufacturer, according to him, said it was a 7-minute injection time for prairie dog burrows, and that he found that there was a lot of dig-ins, again, that they were, or dig-outs, and so he wasn't sure if he was getting any real success. In hindsight, I think what he was struggling with was that, and I think it's a timing thing. I haven't been able to prove this yet, but I think if you're fumigating a prairie dog burrow earlier in the season, you will find that other prairie dogs will go down and dig those burrows that you've closed off out. Either they're looking for the carcasses, or they're just trying to get a new burrow, or they're investigating. And so it gives you a lot of false negatives, in the sense that it's a false negative that you think that you didn't control the prairie dog when in fact you did, because you're relying only on whether the burrow was reopened or not. And so it can give you some false negatives in that sense. So my suggestion is make sure that if you're going to do a fumigation, fumigate all the burrows. That way you're not having a prairie dog from an untreated burrow coming over and digging out, or do it later in the season. Because when I did it this past summer using a different device, I didn't have this dig out problem, and I was checking for about 3 days afterwards to see if there was a dig out. So in any event, the tank is quite small, so the producer said that he had to refill after the 4 prairie dog burrows. And also, because you don't have the smokability, you're not always sure if 2 burrows are connected or not. Now, let me add a little bit more information on that as well, and that is, when I was doing prairie dog work, 85% of the prairie dog burrows I was treating, there was only 1 burrow. Only 15% had more than 1. So, which is kind of weird. That was very counterintuitive. I was not anticipating that. I expected prairie dogs to have 2 burrows, 2 holes for 1 burrow. And 85% of them only had 1. So that's one advantage with the smokes, because that's how I was able to verify that. All right, let's talk about carbon monoxide. Oh, there is one other product that I didn't mention, and that was the the rodent eliminator. And I've done a whole podcast on the rodent eliminator, and that was done probably in the spring of 2021, so you can definitely go and check that out. So I'm not trying to diss that. I just didn't have that included on this particular PowerPoint. And I think there might be others. So I'm only aware of 4 carbon monoxide devices. Now, let me do a little sidebar here. I got criticized by a manufacturer when I called they were carbon monoxide generating devices, because he thought that type of language would make the product under the purview of the EPA. As we know, sometimes the EPA sometimes feels its oats and it just wants to consume more power. This is part of the regulatory state that we're certainly struggling with here in America, where the government just never seems to, unelected government agencies never seem to stop. And they seem to go well beyond the mandate that should be done by legislatures. But without getting into the politics of it, I can certainly appreciate this producer's concern. And I asked him, I said, well, do you have another term to use? And unfortunately, he didn't give me any options. So maybe rather than calling it carbon monoxide generating devices, maybe we just call them carbon monoxide devices. I would welcome feedback on this, because I certainly don't want to use language that's going to, tickle the ears of EPA that all of a sudden we were going to regulate this the way they jumped on using carbon dioxide for rats, for instance. I don't want that to happen. But by the same token, I want to have a general category for this without having to list every single manufacturer and every single product of the device. So that's just not going to work. So I would love to get some feedback from you if you have an idea of what we can call this. We need to kind of get our language together, but we need to be accurate and certainly appropriate if there's a better way of phrasing it. The best idea I have is carbon monoxide devices. So I'll leave it at that. All right, let's talk about carbon monoxide here. So there's your CAS number. And what's the CAS number for? That's sort of an international number used to identify various compounds. So you can use that number there to do a lot more in-depth research on carbon monoxide, and it'll open up a whole world for you if you wish to get it. And that can be helpful if you're going to be doing additional training, perhaps of staff and things, because you're going to learn things about carbon monoxide that you may not know, and that can be important. The more you know about your poison, the better you're able to use it to the best effect and the safest effect. Okay, so couple things about carbon monoxide: colorless, odorless gas. So what this means for you is you're not going to know if you're being poisoned if you just think, oh, I'm going to smell it. No, you're not going to smell it. You're not going to be able to see it. You just have to know it's there. You say, well, I'll get a carbon monoxide detector. You're going to have to get an industrial one, because I tried to use one of the ones that we use for homes, and I actually put it over a burrow to see if the gas was coming out of another burrow. We thought these two burrows were connected, and I put the device there. That was useless. I even put the carbon monoxide detector right in front of the exhaust of the carbon monoxide device, and it took a while for it to go off. And there's some reasons for that, because it's not designed for that kind of intensity. It's so, as I understood it, and I'll have to go back and refresh my memory as to why, when I talked to the manufacturer of the testing device, why that didn't go off the way I thought it should. So it was kind of weird that way. Carbon monoxide is extraordinarily toxic, and it's important that you appreciate that. That sometimes we think, oh, it's all, it's from my gasoline-powered engine, it's around my car. No big deal. No, it is a big deal, and it's much more toxic than people realize. And there's one more issue about carbon monoxide, and that it's miscible. And that is, it just mixes in with the atmosphere very, very well. I believe it's slightly lighter than air, but not very much. And so it just sort of mixes into the air very easily. So it's not like aluminum phosphide, where phosphine gas is heavier than air and it wants to drop down into the burrow. So that's going to be important, so you can be exposed to carbon monoxide much more easily than other things. And so what is carbon monoxide the result of? It's the result of an incomplete combustion of a internal combustion engine or some sort of fire. It's where there's not a sufficient amount of oxygen, and so you get this incomplete burn. So what causes carbon monoxide poisoning? Well, carbon monoxide is what bonds with the hemoglobin. Now, the hemoglobin is the red part of your red blood cells. And so the hemoglobin is supposed to bond with oxygen and move oxygen around your body. You need oxygen to survive. But when carbon monoxide is present, hemoglobin has a better chemical affinity for carbon monoxide. So if your hemoglobin has a choice, oxygen or carbon monoxide, it's going to grab onto the carbon monoxide. In fact, it's 300 times more attracted to carbon monoxide than it is to oxygen. So once the hemoglobin bonds with the carbon monoxide, it does no room to carry oxygen. So essentially, carbon monoxide poisoning kills because it suffocates the animal at the cellular level. We have suffocation, like someone choking you. That's one form of suffocation. But with carbon monoxide, you're suffocating at the cellular level. So your blood's moving around your body, but there's no oxygen being carried by the blood because it's all taken up with carbon monoxide. Now, obviously, you have to get enough concentration for it to have an effect, okay? But the effect, the concentration's not that high. It doesn't take much to start getting a negative effect with carbon monoxide. So recognize that carbon monoxide products are not regulated. By that I mean the devices side. They're not regulated. We have pesticides that have carbon monoxide, and those are regulated by the EPA. But notice these numbers here, 6,400 parts per million. So if you're breathing atmosphere of 6,400 parts per million, now remember, one of the cheetah was putting out 25,000 parts per million. Okay, so this is just a fraction of that. About 1/4 of that is, if you're exposed to that in 2 minutes, you're going to start getting a headache. And headaches are one of the early signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. So I want you to tell yourself and your technicians and others, understand that carbon monoxide poisoning, one of the early signs is a headache. So if you're in the field and you're getting a headache, don't ignore that. Don't just think, oh, I have too much stress. Maybe the previous client was yelling at me or whatever. Make sure you don't ignore that. Don't just simply pop some pain pills and think you're going to be all right. So think about that. There's also concern about long-term exposure to even low levels of carbon monoxide, that it can cause neurological damage. And that can occur over delay over time. So you want to avoid your exposure to carbon monoxide. So when you're treating, you want to stay upwind or perhaps perpendicular to the wind to be sure that the carbon monoxide is being blown away from you. Because you have to remember that even though you're plugging the burrows, well, I thought I'm plugging the burrows, Stephen. Yeah, you are. But there still can be some leakage. And so if you are working with the wind, well, then the burrows that are behind you, the wind's going to be blowing that potential carbon monoxide in your direction. Now you may say, Stephen, you're being really a nervous Nelly. I agree. But, there's just too many things that can go wrong. Why not put everything in your advantage? Why not take those extra steps that just are going to be wise in that direction? Okay? So I'm just going to encourage you to do that. Do not use these devices near structures. Now, I always rely on the manufacturer's advice. If the manufacturer gives you certain tips and restrictions, follow those restrictions. But I also suggest following the Colorado Department of Agriculture guidelines on the use of carbon monoxide devices. The information on this slide comes from them, and so they define it on the basis of what type of species are you dealing with. So if you're dealing with a ground squirrel, you must be at least 20 feet away from a structure. And if you're dealing with a prairie dog, you have to be at least 100 feet away from a structure. Pocket gopher, you have to be at least 150 feet away from a structure. So my advice is, whichever restriction is more conservative, follow that. So if the manufacturer says you must stay at least 10 feet away from a structure, and I'm just throwing that number out, and this advice says stay 20 feet away, my advice to you is to stay 20 feet away. Because most states do not regulate these devices. So definitely keep that in mind, right? So this is for example, my state of Montana. We do not regulate carbon monoxide devices. So you could literally, I think it's stupid, but you could pump a rat burrow right up against the foundation. Now, I would strenuously ask that you don't do that, but as far as the state of Montana is concerned, there's nothing illegal about that. Now, there may be something illegal about the product you're using. Your manufacturer may have a restriction on that, but as far as our department's concerned, I'm not aware of any restriction on that. So, because I've tried to get that regulation put in, but I'm just telling you, be careful with these products, right? It's not a nuclear bomb, but be careful with them because, again, that carbon monoxide, there may be cracks in foundations and that could leak into the house. So you want to make sure you're staying away from structures, especially those occupied by humans and animals. All right, so what are some of the best practices with carbon monoxide devices? You want to use moist soil. Here's my little picture in the lower left. Notice how the water fills the gaps of the soil, because we think of soil as solid, but it's not. It's actually filled with air pockets because the particles of soil create air gaps. And so when you're pumping fumigation into a burrow, some of that's going to leak into the surrounding soil. But with moist soil, it's more likely to be held in the burrow itself. So if I tell people, look, you want it with toxicants, you want it dry. With fumigants, you want it wet. So if you can fumigate after a rain, all the better. And if you're using an ignitable gas cartridge, it's even safer for you as well. Same way with the wind. If you're pumping gas into a burrow, and that burrow opening is connected to another opening, you can have a siphoning effect. So you got to make sure that you're not only sealing around your hose that you're pumping into the ground, but that you're also making sure you're looking to see if there's any connected holes nearby, because otherwise, if you have a slight breeze, it's going to siphon that carbon monoxide gas out. You don't want that to happen. You want that gas concentrated in there, in that burrow system. Now, for the general use fumigants, these are ignitable gas cartridges. Notice the ingredients here, because the ultimate effect is carbon monoxide is being generated, as well as carbon dioxide as well. Consider those fire risks. This is this can be a problem. I'm in a fire-prone state in Montana, so it's something we definitely need to consider, because they burn, and they burn pretty hot. Again, don't use them around structures. You want to make sure you're using the right particular product. They're not all designed for the same species, so be sure you're following those instructions then. And I'm going to definitely advise you to make sure that you can fit the cartridge into the burrow before you light it. It's really stressful if you find that I'm just going to light it and put it in. No, because then you find sometimes it doesn't fit the way you thought, because it was maybe the burrow angled a different way, or the cartridge is too large. You want to avoid that, because this smoke is something you do not want to breathe. It is very acrid, and it'll give you a coughing fit in short order. Other sites that can be used with a giant destroyer, again, this is the one that I believe you can find in most of your hardware stores. It is allowed for different types of animals. Again, make sure that it fits, and you want to make sure your fuse is long enough so that you can get it deep. You're always putting it in fuse side first, and then you're backfilling it. Make sure you don't smother your cartridge. The USDA has a cartridge, the small one. These are quite thick. They're about over an inch, maybe inch and a half, maybe 2 inches wide. Maybe about 2 inches wide. They're quite large. These are used for smaller rodents, and then of course they have the larger ones that are used for coyotes and skunks. Make sure you're following those label requirements, okay? So this is not a discussion on these particular products, but you can see that information there. And again, 3-inch minimum on their particular cartridge. You don't want to have it lighting and flaming out before you put it in the burrow. You want that lit, and you're using the time before it gets to the cartridge to get that down into the burrow so you can begin backfilling it. There's that large cartridge, again, that's used for coyote, red fox, and striped skunk. And that's pretty much about it for that, but I wanted to be sure I emphasized carbon monoxide is dangerous. Do not take it for granted. Make sure that you're protecting yourself, following the manufacturer guidelines. I'm going to suggest if the Colorado guidelines are more conservative than your manufacturer guidelines, follow those guidelines. You're never wrong being more safe. Okay, so that is something to definitely think about. You're never wrong being more safe. And also watch your headaches. Understand that carbon monoxide can bond with your hemoglobin, and it can have long-term effects. So you don't want to keep exposing yourself to it unnecessarily. So I'm not trying to create a fear here. I used it this past summer. It worked extraordinarily well on prairie dogs. I was able to do a 3-minute injection time and got a 90% control. And it has a lot of benefits to it as opposed to some rodenticides, right? So there's some really key things there. So I'm really glad that this is part of our industry now. I just want us to be sure we're careful with carbon monoxide, and I hope this has given you a little bit more understanding about carbon monoxide because it is a very toxic ingredient. My name is Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Wildlife Control Consultant. Living the Wildlife podcast is part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Again, do take a few moments, drop me an email. This presentation today was was the result of someone asking about carbon monoxide, so perhaps there's a topic you would like me to cover as well. I would welcome that type of input. As a side note, I am looking for individuals who have access to rodent scat. I'm looking for Norway rat scat and roof rat scat and confirmed house mouse scat. If you have some that you would like to sell me, I'll pay for shipping, of course. I would love to hear from you. Definitely reach out. Again, my email is wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. We do hope that you will subscribe to our podcast and join us on Facebook. Join the revolution as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Thanks for listening, everyone. Again, this is Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.